Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Although this country is built on immigration, immigration continues to be one of the most heated issues in the U.S. during and outside of the election cycles. During this U.S. election campaign at the 6th Democratic debate, Bernie Sanders put Clinton on the spot, calling her stance on children crossing the border into question. Let's have a look.
Secretary Clinton, I do have a disagreement here. If my memory is correct, I think when we saw children coming from these horrendously violent areas of Honduras and neighboring countries, people who are fleeing drug violence and cartel violence, I thought it was a good idea to allow those children to stay in this country. That was not, as I understand it, the Secretary's position.
But Clinton isn't alone in receiving criticism. Sanders has also come under fire during the debate for not supporting a bill introduced by Senator Ted Kennedy in 2007, which would have allowed immigrants to gain legal status. Joining us now from Oakland, California to unpack all of this is David Bacon. David is an award-winning photojournalist, author, and immigrant rights activist who spent over 20 years as a labor organizer. His most recent book is The Right to Stay Home: How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Immigration. David, so good to have you back on the Real News Network.
Morning.
So Sanders, in that comment that we just rolled in, seems to be attacking Hillary Clinton on the issue of children coming from Central America. But give us a sense of where each of the candidates are when it comes to immigration. Here I mean Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Okay, well, in that exchange to begin with, Bernie Sanders is bringing up the fact that Hillary Clinton supported the Obama action in 2014, in which he basically began putting the mothers and children who were coming in from Central America into detention centers. In fact, built 2 new detention centers in Texas to hold them, and said that the purpose was to send a message to parents in Central America, so they were bad parents, not to send their kids north. And so Hillary Clinton supported Obama and said it was necessary to send what she called a clear message to people in Central America not to come, not to send their kids. You know, one of the ironies, this is just a little side note, but one of the ironies I've been thinking about is that, you know, now we also have a big wave of Cubans coming from Costa Rica and directly from Cuba, and nobody is saying that there should be a clear message sent to keep Cubans from coming to the United States. In fact, at the minute somebody from Cuba puts their foot on U.S. soil, they essentially get a green card. Legal permanent residence status, unlike the Central American migrants who are thrown into detention centers. So there's a vast disparity, which has to do with U.S. politics and, you know, sending a message. I didn't hear the administration or Hillary Clinton say that it was necessary to send a message to anybody else other than these women and their children. Now, you know, I think to be fair, we ought to say that she's backtracked on that, and now says that she doesn't think that it's a good idea to throw families into detention centers, and has criticized the administration for its deportation rates. Now, she is saying that Bernie Sanders voted against the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill in 2007. That's true. But the reason why he did it was not because he was opposing legalization, which is what she's implying. He voted against it because he did not want to vote in favor of the guest worker programs that were a big part of that bill. In fact, he quoted the Southern Poverty Law Center's study, which found that the treatment of guest workers in the United States was what they called close to slavery. Bernie Sanders has kind of changed his position in a way on this, however. He voted for a comprehensive immigration bill, Senate Bill 744 in 2013, which in some ways had guest worker provisions which were worse. And his position, as it's explained on his website, says that he is in favor of reforms to those guest worker programs, where they're called the H programs, H2A for agricultural workers and H2B for people who plant pine trees in forests, for instance, and H1B for tech workers. That's a very significant change in position because many progressive immigrant rights activists, unions, civil rights activists believe that these programs cannot be reformed. That's why they're called close to slavery. So calling for reform in a way is softening a position, and indirectly, this is what employers want. The cry for guest workers is not coming from immigrant communities here in the United States. It's coming from employers who want these workers because they have very few rights and their wages are low. There's sort of shadings in the position of both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders here. But I think that Bernie Sanders' position has been, generally speaking, more pro-immigrant and has been more consistent. And it's easier to tell what he might do if he were president. It's pretty unclear to tell what Hillary Clinton would do on immigration, other than that she would vote for comprehensive immigration reform bills. And I think doing that in many ways because of the labor supply programs just as much as she might do it because she's in favor of legalization programs.
And let's look at the Republican candidates for a minute here. There is a history. For example, Ronald Reagan had introduced an amnesty bill that was actually a very good policy on the Republican side in terms of immigration. Where are the current candidates on immigration, and who stands out as one of the more progressive ones?
Well, nobody really stands out as a progressive candidate on immigration. I guess maybe the one who is less anti-immigrant is the governor of Ohio, John Kasich. Jeb Bush, he's sounding very anti-immigrant now. When he was in Florida, he was somewhat less anti-immigrant. But really, the Republicans who are sort of softer on immigration, what they're really after, they're after the labor supply programs. They're responding to employers and to employer needs and saying that, we need a kind of a immigration policy that's going to welcome immigrants, but welcome them as workers in programs that are manipulated by employers, really. There are no Republican candidates who are really talking about a legalization program for the undocumented people who are here in the United States. They're all pretty uniformly against it. And in some cases, they're extremely against it. Ted Cruz and Donald Trump are competing with each other to see who can be more hostile to immigrants, more in favor of deportations, more in favor of putting people into detention centers. In fact, I think one of the things we're seeing in this current election process is a rising activity, especially among young immigrants, dreamers, the people who got a sort of semi-legal status under the Obama order called DACA, or deferred deportation for child arrivals, which basically said that for young people who were brought to the United States at a very young age and went to school here and fulfilled certain requirements, that they were going to be given a status that would free them at least from the threat of deportation. And so you see a lot of young people now in states like Nevada on phone banks, handing out leaflets, participating in this process, supporting Democrats, I think on both sides, whether Clinton or Sanders, but in part because they are listening to these Republican candidates, and I think recognizing the danger to themselves and to their families and to their communities if they're elected. Because after all, Donald Trump is saying that he would immediately deport all of the undocumented people in the United States. At the maximum in 1954, the United States deported 1,054,000 people that year in what was called Operation Wetback. But to talk about deporting 11 or 12 million people would be, it would just be an enormous undertaking, and it would terrorize communities really permanently. My mind boggles really at the thought of being able to, throw 11 million people out of the United States at one time, what it would mean.
David Bacon, let's continue this discussion in a second segment where I'd like to take up how you would advise some of the candidates on immigration. So stay tuned.